Right then, I will now talk about some Games Workshop 40k news that has been exploding. However, this stuff is worth talking about, but it's not something I want to get bogged down in all the time. But this announcement of Marvel and Games Workshop is big enough that, I can't really ignore it. I have to talk about it, so this is the video. So it was recently announced that Games Workshop and Marvel will be collaborating on a series of comics. Unsurprisingly, many of you have been asking for my opinion on this. However, I thought it would be more interesting to see the community's reaction to this than just a generic blanket news reveal of, hey, this is a thing, what do you think about it, tell me down below. Now, unsurprisingly, the announcement appears to have been met with very little positive praise. It seems to have instead been a mixture of panic, horror, and guarded optimism. And the reasons for this are pretty obvious. The primary one being people do not like the idea of a cherished, well-established, I guess to a degree, whilst it's global, it's still a kind of small community-based thing that's come out of the UK and has been here for such a long time. And the idea of this going into the huge mainstream sphere of something like Marvel, and potentially in the future you have the concept of things like movies occurring. The idea of that and what it could mean is scary for people, because we have seen over many years the Star Wars franchise, some of these superhero franchise, things which at one time had the potential to be very strong, become very generic, very diluted, and just crap. Now when it comes to my position, how I feel, it's definitely in the middle of being in a mixture of panic, horror, and guarded optimism. But also just to note, I know this announcement was purely about comics, but I know everybody is thinking about movies, so I will mention this as well, and this will probably be a bit all over the place, but I'll try to somehow collect my very scattered thoughts on this, because I don't really have a script, I'm just sort of doing some bullet points and talking around it. So first I should just say I have never been very interested in comics. I've never spent a significant amount of time reading them, and to be quite honest, Games Workshop have produced a range of comics already that existed alongside the books and so on, other things in 40k. Those comics, they had little impact or association, really. They're pretty interesting, but it's whatever. Now when it comes to comic book series and characters and so on, Marvel, DC, Batman is about the most that I can cope with because he's a pretty dark character and a little more grounded. I love stuff like Watchmen as well because it's got that dark edge to it. It's a bit crazy, it's out there, but it's also more interesting. You use your imagination a little bit more there. Because in something like Watchmen, there's a lot of ideological stuff, a lot of interesting things. This is why graphic novels I think are often more interesting. Even Dread, as cool as it is, it's not maybe challenging you in some big, psychological or ideological way. It's not very philosophical. Whereas something like Watchmen was very philosophical. And I think to a degree, as much as it might be surprising to say, even 40k can be quite philosophical, because there's a lot of stuff in 40k to do with man's inhumanity to man. It's got stuff to do with kind of what does it mean to be an individual, what does it mean to be a society, how do these things function. It's dealing with some often quite big concepts. But like I said, when you come back to the comic books, I guess one of the things that I would say I was interested in was the kind of origins of comic books and superheroes, and you go back to sort of like the origins of Superman and how he was very different originally to where he is later, and I know Superman's DC, not Marvel, by the way. Then you got the kind of like very on-the-nose Captain America, and these things, they kind of really reflect the mood of the period and the time, and of course in the 1940s you had World War II, and so the characters, they're wanting to, through the comic books that they're selling, support the kind of mood of the country and so on and so on. So there is this kind of thing, almost historically, where comics do kind of represent and reflect and bleed the sort of political vibe that's going on, and of course maybe they want to sell that to an audience and so on, right? But like I said, I do just find it very interesting. You go back and look at things like the origins of Superman originally, and Superman was pretty rough originally. He was more like a vigilante, didn't work with police, kind of killed people, and was generally a lot more out there. Not quite Judge Dredd, but he was definitely not the sort of goody two-shoes that he became later on. And so looking back and finding things like this are pretty interesting to me. But like I say, when you come to kind of like Spider-Man, Iron Man, blah blah blah, Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, Fantastic Four, all this stuff, it just feels very, very milquetoast to me. It's something which has never appealed to me, not as a kid, not now. It's just something that I've always just been like, I don't know, it's like, it reminds me of just like Saturday morning, not comics, but Saturday morning like toy adverts, commercial break adverts, that kind of stuff. Again, feel free to hate me for it, but just comic books have never appealed to me. Comic book characters have never appealed to me. However, you come to some things like X-Men, and I think X-Men has always been a little bit more interesting there. You know, there's a few more things going on with it. I've enjoyed that as a concept. Again, I'd never read the comic books, and that was largely because comic books were not really a thing in the UK. I don't know, maybe some parts of the UK, but for me it wasn't at all. But things like the X-Men cartoon series from the 90s, I loved that. Along with stuff like the Batman series from the 90s, the graphic art in that was amazing. Most of the movies for the X-Men stuff are pretty awesome. They sort of deteriorated and lost my attention now. But the point is, there's some stuff that I do enjoy that's come out of comic books and comic book stuff. But a lot of it, like I say, especially the Spider-Man, I mean, I also find it hilarious. Loads of these comic book series, they sort of start up like Batman as well, you know, and they start up and they do a movie or two. And then somebody comes on and goes, right, that's shit, we're starting again. And then they do another movie or two, and then they go, right, we're starting again, forget all that doesn't exist, And I think this is kind of what people are kind of scared of when it comes to stuff like Marvel, cinematic universes, all this kind of stuff, is this constant resetting. I'm not saying that's the only thing, right, but that's one thing. It's the thing that always drives me crazy. It's why I never feel like getting invested in this stuff, because they do one movie, two movies, and they're like, right, that's gone, forget it, that's not a thing. You know, Terminator went down that route as well, with all these constant timelines and resets and all this stuff. Once movies start getting into multiple timelines, resetting of timelines, you've lost me. I don't care. I don't want to hear it. I don't care. You've completely lost me. I'm not interested anymore. And this is why, you know, 40k and Warhammer is such a great one, because it has this massive established timeline that exists. It's not changing. You can't piss around with that timeline, and you can't piss around with the things which have occurred and exist within that timeline as well. Unless, of course, caveat, you want to get into the whole time travel and blah blah blah, and, you know, causality and all these things. But my point here is, you know, when it comes to this comic book stuff, all I've ever seen with it is just reset. It's like, don't you already have a huge existing pool of information to draw from to make these movies? What are you playing at? Why aren't you just drawing from that information and then carrying it through? What happens if 40k turned into kind of like a movie series like this? Are they going to do like one movie, two movies, and then they're going to go, you know what, we didn't like those? Or a director comes in and goes, you know, that first Horus Heresy movie, I'm not really feeling it, so I'm going to come in, I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to add in some stuff which wasn't there the first time. Are we going to go down that road? Because I do not have the patience for it. But those, of course, are not the only reasons. There are other reasons why people are freaking out about this association. And the first is Marvel pushing whatever sort of in-house political or ideological agendas they have going on through their work into 40k. Now again, this is something that I was aware of, I've read about it, but it's not something I've seen firsthand, because as I said, I'm not really a big fan of comic books, and I'm not really into Marvel or any of their movies and all this kind of stuff. But apparently that is a thing which has been happening, and like I say, you don't need to go on and on, tell me about it. I've read this stuff, I know roughly what's going on. But just generally speaking though, this has been demonstrated time and time again that at this point in time, that is not a good thing to do with any franchise, for the simple reason that people are not stupid and they don't like stuff being forced into narratives. And it's not because people are just getting all triggered and sweaty. It's not even to do with viewing figures or box office turnover. It's because by approaching a story with a preconceived idea of we need to fit this circle through this square hole, you end up with no choice but to just force it through, and in doing so it breaks the whole thing. Now you are somewhat seeing this with the new Star Wars movies. In the rebooted Star Wars movies, they have pushed such generic, bland storytelling that sought not to be imaginative or dramatic or push any real boundaries at all, but instead Disney wanted to turn out glossy CGI Star Wars nostalgic schlock, while simultaneously ensuring that it checked all the boxes for the op-ed writers of the modern era. Now in those movies, they were pretty clever, because they have understood finally, and this is actually a positive thing, they've understood that when you see too much CGI on screen, your eye can tell the difference, your brain can tell the difference. You see too much CGI and you realise that there's no danger, there's no risk, there's no too much of anything going on there. This is why people like to watch stunts, okay? When you look at older movies from the 70s and the 80s and stuff, and you see people doing stunts, you think, holy crap, that guy's actually hanging off there, that guy just fell off that thing, he jumped across there. There's a little bit of investment, albeit you know it's in a controlled environment, you know it's in a movie, you know that, you know, it would have been fine, otherwise they wouldn't have put it out there. But nonetheless, it's a guy doing a thing. However, when you see one huge CGI sequence and people flying all over the place and this happening and stuff blows up and blah blah blah, it's all fine, but again, it's just maybe blue screen. And if that's the case, you know that, and therefore you know that there's no, you're just sitting there and you're like, yeah, just blows up, whatever, you know, you don't really care. but they did it enough that it was nostalgic enough. You know, this kind of stuff goes very hand in hand with the audiences. Basically, they're appealing to me. You know, they're appealing to the audience of millennials who have got a lot of nostalgia for the 80s, and so they want to kind of blend that stuff together. And it's working. It's something, you know, stuff like Stranger Things. Stranger Things, for as popular as it is just a horrific. It's just like Stranger Things is like Black Mirror. It's like there's actually nothing that new in it. It is just a amalgamation of stories that have come before that they've taken elements from and just blended together. Like Black Mirror has just got so much Philip K. Dick stuff in it that I can't even watch it. It's all just very trite, very trotted out. It's been done before. And when we're talking about things that have been done before, Star Wars The Force Awakens was just right up there. There's a lot to be said for kind of comfort viewing, nostalgia viewing. You know, people want to sit at home, put Friends on Netflix and just kind of binge. And that's where that kind of comes from. It's from people retreating from the real world and not having to deal with any of the bullshit there. And this is why forcing your political agendas or other agendas into people's entertainment is not a good thing, because people go to that entertainment because of the fact they want to get away from that stuff. And then when they come to their entertainment and they have to deal with that shit in their entertainment, that's what pisses people off. But it's like, can we please just enjoy a story for what it is? And a story can be anything, okay? A story, if you want to get into genders and stuff like that as well, you know, there's nothing wrong with having a narrative which is all male or all female or mixture of both or whatever, because it is a story. It's a story. It's not real world. You don't have to apply real world equivalencies to fictional narratives because it is a fictional narrative. But when you have decades of established narrative, established books, established lore or whatever, it's like if you came along to Lord of the Rings and you just decided, hey, you know what, we're going to have like all female hobbits in Lord of the Rings and we're just going to roll with that. People would lose their shit, because upending established narratives and established fiction, people are invested in that because it's something that they've read a long time ago. They have really kind of become embedded with understanding the story, loving the stories, all these kind of stuff. Suddenly somebody comes along and goes, yeah, you know that thing which you have been very invested in for a long time, we're just going to turn it upside down and fuck you. You know, people do not like that happening. I think, you know, movies and games, they always want to be very popular, they always want to make as much money as possible, but I think really what we've seen in the last sort of 5 to 10 years is a lot of this stuff kind of going, okay, how can we appeal to everybody? Instead of just making a good thing, some of the big selling titles and stuff, they're still doing well, but they have definitely kind of not been doing as well as perhaps they should have been. And I think the reason for that is because they've gone too wide, too broad. You appeal to a specific audience, that specific audience is going to love that product and they're going to stay with that, and they're going to be loyal to that product. But it should be obvious to anybody that when you open something up too big, and this is usually what happens when, you see, this is the kind of contradiction between business and creativity, which is that creativity has a lot of soul and a lot of passion for what it's doing. Because the creator is invested in what they're doing, you feel invested in what it is that they're presenting to you. But when you go too broad, too wide, in order to make that happen, there's a whole process which has to occur, which is basically figuring out the different demographics, figuring out how you can appeal to those people, how it's going to work, and so on and so on.
You want a realistic, down-to-earth show that's completely off the wall and swarming with magic robots.
Yeah. And also, you should win things by watching.
They appeal, you know, they try to appeal to everybody and end up appealing to nobody. And I think this kind of broad attempt to appeal to so many people is really kind of like a culmination of basically what I guess we would call political correctness. It's trying to appeal to everybody and keep everybody happy. Just offend nobody, you know, everybody's cool, it's all good. However, I think it's fairly clear that that sort of time, that era of that sort of thing is coming to an end, and that people, or at least a significant percentage of people in society, have kind of had enough of, I would say, just kind of other people's agendas being rammed down their throats. And whether you agree with that being the right way forward or not is really largely irrelevant. This is what has happened, and it doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon. And again, I'm not trying to drag real world politics into this or anything like that, but all I'm literally saying is that there just seems to have been a change in the consciousness of people, wherever it is in the world. I think people have just kind of come into a different sort of period now. I think the way that people talk to one another, it's not all good. You know, there's a lot of very, very split, two divided opinions, and I also think there's not enough people listening to other people, you know, listening to other people and saying like, you know, look, I respect your opinion, but I just disagree, and I'm going to go in a different direction to you. It's fine to have a different opinion and just go your own way. Whenever I try to talk to people, it doesn't matter what it's about, I will try my best to listen to them. You know, there's going to be times where I just can't deal with it personally, and I hold my hands up and say, you know, sorry, I just can't deal with that, I'm not interested, you know? But most of the time I try to listen to other people's opinions and sort of at least reach some kind of middle ground with people, because I feel that's really important. But to come back to the Disney Star Wars, and this is relevant to the 40k stuff, which we'll get back into in a minute, what Disney have ended up doing by pushing out box-ticking content, which looks visually great, but is ultimately devoid of quality narrative or really anything meaningful. It's got no real investment in your characters, no pushing of the story to really unexpected places. Even like I say in, you know, The Last Jedi, where they followed that up, it didn't really go anywhere. And I'll apologise now to Star Wars fans for again bringing this up, but not to mention Disney setting fire to all the lore that existed beforehand, leaving you with a franchise which has written itself into a corner and is struggling to find a way out. Still raking in tons of cash though, but with that said, okay, let me just run down for you the profit margins of these movies. Now, The Force Awakens brought in global sales of over $2 billion, yet its sequel, The Last Jedi, was roughly half that, at $1.3 billion. Now, it's worth saying, of course, sequels always do worse than original movies. However, it's worth also remembering that The Force Awakens was supposed to be a soft reboot Kickstarter, so seeing a profits nearly cut in half is not a good sign, especially when you look at the original trilogy, remembering of course that inflation is a thing and that these are unadjusted figures. So in the original movies, A New Hope, the worldwide box office was $786 million. That's a significant amount even for the time, and its production budget was only $11 million. Now, inflation or not, that's still a massive profit margin. Now then we come to Empire, and that's coming in with $534 million global box office, but the production budget for that was double, $23 million. And then you come to Return of the Jedi, which had $572 million worldwide box office, and its production $32 million. So again, regardless adjusting for inflation, huge profit margins there comparative to the modern films. And again, there's going to be to do with, you know, viewing and how people view media these days, and there's all sorts of other things to consider there. But nonetheless, it gives you a good idea about how that is kind of working, and it also demonstrates to you that despite the sequels in the older movies, yes, they did have a drop, but they didn't have that same kind of drop that you're seeing with the modern films. Now, more currently interesting are the spin-off movies, the so-called Star Wars stories. Rogue One, again, brought in just over $1 billion globally. Now that's a good profit from a $200 million production cost, except when you consider that The Force Awakens cost $245 million and made nearly double the profit of Rogue One. Globally, you can see that there is something to read into there. However, their second escapade of Solo, a Star Wars movie, this really was the movie that set off the major alarm bells at Disney HQ. Solo cost Disney $275 million. Now that's the most of all the movies in the rebooted franchise, yet it only brought in globally just under $400 million. That is an absolutely devastating failure by any measurement you want to make in movie profit margin perspectives anyway. And this has then been coupled with just a reported general decline in the sales, or I guess the interest of sales in Star Wars stuff, which is, you know, just merchandising, games, all this other stuff. And that's what probably led to Disney's CEO to announce last year that they were slowing down making these movies. Now that should not actually be a bad thing when it comes to Star Wars, or people that enjoy the Star Wars franchise, because in theory what it should mean is by having more time to think about what it is they're making, they should make better choices in terms of the narrative and all these other elements, and they should potentially come up with better movies. Because if they're not just smashing this stuff out the door, they don't have to worry about making it look shiny and making the box ticks. You know, what they can focus on is making sure it has a coherent, well-established, invested story which draws you in, makes you interested in the characters, makes you interested in what could happen. You know, the problem with the newer movies is that it was just very like, whatever, who cares, this is happening, we know the story on this part, you know, she's going to be alright, blah blah blah. You know, the Last Jedi, it should have gone in a completely different direction. Should have ended up with Rey and Kylo Ren going off and saying like, hey, we're going to forge our own new, you know, Jedi Order, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. You know, there's a load of different directions that they could have gone in, and instead they've just gone back to same. And I think that's why people are getting, you know, disinterested in this stuff, because it's just like, oh yeah, so we're just basically doing the same stuff that went before again. You know, there's nothing new, there's nothing interesting there. Now, I've been rambling about Star Wars for ages. What does all this have to do with 40k and Marvel? Well, the point is, simply playing it safe is not what people enjoy, or they may enjoy briefly but become very quickly bored of. The audience of 40k is not the audience of, say, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The audience of 40k is not the audience of The Force Awakens, or Spider-Man, or Wonder Woman, or Rogue One, or Captain Hulking Thor of America, you know? And the reason for that is that 40k is filled to the brim with horrific violence, xenophobia, bleakness, depressing misery. It contains in nearly all races of the galaxy doses of forced labour, enslavement of captives. It's a dark, dark universe. A 40k movie would be the kind where some beautifully hopeful and optimistic individual is slowly broken down and eventually lost over a period of 90 or 120 minutes. The only acceptable 40k movies should be something on par with war epics like Black Hawk Down, dark cyberpunk noir like Blade Runner, the original one, or 2049, or classic horror movies like Hellraiser, Event Horizon, and so on. TV shows like Band of Brothers spring to mind as well. This is the kind of stuff which fits much better and is sort of more connected with that. But what you wouldn't want to see as well, you would not want to see something like David Lynch's Dune. Now look, I love that movie, but there is one thing again that audiences hate, and that is basically things being explained to them. This is one of the reasons why the original Blade Runner, before it had the director's cut, was a catastrophic failure, because I think they had some kind of voiceover or narrative, or it was considered too complex for the audience to understand, and so they felt they had to explain everything. And I feel, and again, like in David Lynch's Dune, in that movie, there's a lot of weird exposition. There's lots of things where they thought, okay, this is so complex, we have to kind of force narrative in here, and it feels really jarring. This is the point in general as well when it comes to whether it's these Marvel 40k comic books, or whether we're talking about movies, or whether we're just talking about 40k in the mainstream media. This idea of forcing things in. People can tell, people don't like it. It doesn't go down well with an audience where you force stuff in. And 40k, I think one danger there is that you could end up, if we went down movies, not so much comic books, but if you went to movies, you could see that a 40k movie, they're going to be very, very paranoid that people aren't going to understand what's happening. Rightly so, because it's very, very complicated. What they would need to do is they need to find some method to keep people's interest and draw them in whilst not having to cover all those other elements. And look, I know I'm talking about movies a lot here, but it's because it's all kind of related, alright? You know, comic books, movies, whatever. It's all to do with narrative, okay? So don't get too hung up on this. But, you know, one thing I want to say as well is that on top of all of this other stuff, it still amazes me that people do not realise that the darkness of 40k is also a parody. It's amazing to me when people don't realise this. It's not meant to be serious. It's a dark comedy. It's always been that way. If you hadn't understood that, it's like, how did you not understand that? Everything in 40k, it's a parody. It's pushed to an extreme for comical effect. You know, we often talk about this in you know, the comments and stuff. People are like, oh, it's so crazy, 40k. Why do you think there's so many memes when it comes to 40k? It's because it's insane. It's ridiculous. It's over the top. You know, everything in 40k is over the top. That should be a gigantic clue to you that it is not a serious sort of world. And yet, of course, somebody like myself, I love to take it seriously. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you see, 40k, it's basically on par with something like Evil Dead or Brain Dead or Doom, as in the original sort of games, or Brutal Doom, right? Cutting demons in half with a chainsaw, showered in blood. Hilarious. Brain Dead, like the lawnmower scene, okay?
Party's over.
Where there's like zombies in the house, and in Brain Dead he's got this fucking lawnmower and he's holding it up and he's just lawnmowering the zombies. You know, I was in a cinema in London where they were showing that movie and the entire audience was pissing themselves. I've never been in a cinema where people are laughing so much at this guy chainsawing zombies to death. You know, and it also features one of my favourite ever lines delivered by an Australian kung fu priest.
I kick ass for the Lord!
So look, now, as much as I love to take 40k super seriously, which you know that I do, and I think about it in those terms because that's what I like to do. I like to think of all of the different narratives and different guilds and the house nobles and hives, and you know, I like to think of it from a serious narrative point of view. But I'm also well aware that that is not what 40k is. 40k is a dark comedy. It's laughing out loud about how fucked up everything is when you go down these roads and you sort of, you know, end up in this nightmare scenario with humanity and just how brutal and devastating and miserable it is. And then you've got all the nightmare other races of the galaxy, the Tyranids, which are obviously sort of brutal horror. At what point when you heard the orcs speaking like an East London accent, the orcs are meant to be like football hooligans, you know? It's like, if you've seen that and not understood that 40k is a comedy, you really need to sort of read between the lines, you know. And we got Eisenhorn as well, so we got this on the table to see what's going to happen with Eisenhorn, and you know, a lot of people are waiting to see just how that is handled and what's going to happen there. Now there's plenty of movies and stuff that deal with very dark horror, either in a comical way, like I just said, or a bleak way, or a deeply psychological and ideological way, or philosophical way. Stuff like Interstellar and all the heavy, not horror, you know, it's very grandiose and emotional and lots of big concepts going on there. And you could easily apply this to 40k as well. What is difficult to imagine is Marvel being the studio to take those kind of concepts and deliver it, for several reasons. Firstly, the lore of 40k, as we know, is excessively complex, and even the official writers of the novels have a difficult time often keeping things straight without accidentally creating glaring contradictions. And these are people that are very, very invested in that world. But, you know, fair's fair, given that Marvel are a studio full of writers and artists that are heavily into worlds that are to do with comics, probably they're into tabletop gaming and so on, it's very plausible that they have people there, or a team of people that are set up, that are thinking of and know the 40k verse very well, or that they will specifically get people in with that in mind. Or maybe that's a condition that Games Workshop have presented to them. We don't have any of this kind of information, you know, we don't know the details, but maybe that was a condition. They said, okay, look, you know, if you want to get people writing this stuff, they have to know all this stuff, otherwise it's going to be a shambles, right? So let's just assume for now that that's the case. We have got no idea who would be writing this content. That's the next thing, because writing is very, very important. We have no idea how tough of a reign Games Workshop will be keeping on things. Sometimes they are very tough on things, other times not. Now, I have to say, if you pushed me to make a guess, I would guess they would be holding the reins pretty firmly, at least in the beginning, primarily because of the age we live in, and they probably don't want to light a firestorm that kills this potential new avenue for them or draws undue negative attention to it. You know, while simultaneously then alienating their core audience, you know, logic would dictate that this would be sensible anyway. Because, you know, when you have something as complicated as 40k, those small elements matter. And whilst it can be true that, as I've spoken about before, within 40k it's difficult sometimes to know the specifics of some things. However, there are some things which are generally accepted, and having some specifics, having some details which you can count on and qualify and have as a point of reference, basically having anchors to the lore and the narrative and the world and, you know, the galaxy. All these details matter, because if you don't have those anchor points to hold everything together, then it all falls apart. And that's why those things are really important. Now lastly, I'm not going to just step around or ignore or disingenuously, you know, blank the elephant in the room that is, of course, people's apparent concern about gender politics being forced into 40k. I've not spoken about this. I'm not going to make a habit of speaking about this, because I basically have got everything I need to say right here, and then that's the end of it. I really want to focus just on the lore. I don't want to get into drawn out conversations about this stuff all the time, because, you know, I understand that this is a strong talking point for many people, just as it was in, say, you know, the last Battlefield game. However, what I will say is largely the same as what I said around Battlefield 5. I care primarily about the accuracy of stuff, the authenticity of stuff. So if we're talking about accuracy and authenticity within 40k, that means that when you're doing comic books and you're doing movies, you cannot historically have female Space Marines. And that's not being sexist, that's stating a well-entrenched detail of the lore of 40k that has now been established for some 30 plus years. And this has been mentioned more and more often lately, and as the verse of 40k becomes known to people who have never even heard of it before, and they slowly start to unravel the details of the galaxy of the Imperium, it is as usual triggering op-ed writers for the likes of Polygon, etc. Forget about the fact that in the galaxy of 40k, women can just about do anything else, and have some absolutely epic characters, from Inquisitors to Mechanicus, Forge World leaders, Keepers of the Void Dragon, Tau Commanders, Eldar Phoenix Lords, the list goes on and on. Now, to follow one line of thinking, there are those who would think that there is very much the potential for Games Workshop to create, or write into the lore, female Space Marines, Primaris or otherwise, in the future. Why? Well, because Belisarius Cawl is credited as being the creator of the Black Carapace, which is, you know, part of the process of creating Space Marines that enables them to interact with their power armor, etc., which is one of the, you know, core things which differentiates them to other humans like the Sisters of Battle and so on. Now, the Black Carapace wasn't actually created by Cawl, and that's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to talk about that in another video that I was already working on very soon. The point being, though, some believe that female Marines are now inevitably inevitable. And the thinking being that what will happen is that as 40k grows and grows in the mainstream, it will probably reach a tipping point of social pressure, and they will then write into the lore, not retconning anything, but writing new lore that Cal has managed to adapt the process of marine creation so that now it's possible for both genders. This is my likely suggestion as well for how that's going to happen. And to be honest, that seems a pretty plausible suggestion for if they were going to do it, how they would do it. And what's my view on such a thing? Well, I don't like it. And it's not because I dislike the premise of a female space marine. In many ways, I can actually imagine that being pretty epic. For example, let's just tie in a real-world example of an epic female warrior here. If you've never heard of the Iceni tribe during the Roman occupation of Britain, there is an epic statue of Boudica, the female warrior chief of the Iceni tribe, outside of the Houses of Parliament in Westminster in London. Now, the Iceni tribe had resisted the Roman occupation, or were largely kind of lauding the fact that, you know, they had some independence and so on and so on. And they were punished. Their village was pillaged by Roman centurions. The reasons that led up to that, not super important. The main thing is that Boudica was apparently lashed, her daughters were raped by these centurions, others in the village killed. The assault was meant to kind of, diminish them, break their morale, but it didn't have the effect that the Romans thought that it would. And instead of quelling the dissent from the tribe, Boudica rallied her tribe, allying other tribes, and went on a rampage of bloody revenge and carnage. They invaded a nearby Roman settlement, which is modern-day Colchester. They symbolically decapitated the statue of the Roman emperor. They slaughtered the citizens there. They demolished systematically the town and burned the entire place to the ground. They were very, very pissed off, Boudica leading them. And you can very much imagine these kind of early Britons, this enraged warrior queen. She's often depicted as having red hair, rampaging around, slashing and slaughtering and battling, pretty exciting stuff. After some time, the Romans, of course, would be victorious, but, Boudica should commit suicide rather than be captured. Knowing the Romans, that's probably a pretty good call. So anyway, look, details aside, take that, veil it in 40k, you can imagine it being an epic story. As interesting as that is, what's my point? Well, the point is, Boudica, like many female warriors, have the potential to be absolutely epic in terms of narrative. We already have within 40k the Sisters of Battle, who, while not Space Marines, basically have the same style, ideological passion for the Emperor and the Imperium. So now that I've said all this, you're probably readying for me to say roll on with female Space Marines, or that's definitely going to happen, or whatever. The answer is no. And I'll tell you why. Because for one, like I said, we have the Sisters of Battle, which, as I recall, do not have male figures in, who do not just accept men into their ranks. The more pertinent and established reason, though, is quite simply that, as with anything in 40k, you can write your way around almost anything, okay? You can rationalize it. You can reassemble a circle so that it fits through a square hole in 40k most of the time. The point I'm trying to make is, if Games Workshop had wanted this to be a thing, do you think that they wouldn't have already done this by now? Do you think that they would not have used the opportunity of the Primaris to make it happen? Seriously, if they were going to do this, it would have happened, it should have happened then. It would have made sense to do it then, because Belisarius cool, he's inventing new stuff, he has these Marines, and he goes, oh hey, by the way, I fixed that whole thing about the female-male stuff, it can be just anybody right now. That would have been the thing. But it didn't happen. And I'm pretty confident that because it didn't happen then, I really feel like it's not going to be a thing. The Astartes, they're a fantastic narrative all of their own. It's about brotherhood, it's about warriors being bred and trained only to exist as warriors. The Astartes, to me, they've always basically been the Spartans, they're trained from boyhood to be the finest warriors, standing up against impossible odds. And in movie 300, they didn't feel the need to alter from the original graphic novel and forcing characters there just to tick boxes. And again, it's got some historical relationship, I know, but classic movies like Black Hawk Down, Band of Brothers, etc., these are historical, not fictional. Where do you draw the line? Is just everything and everything and that's the way it is? Or, where are we going to end up? We're going to have historical movies putting in characters which really don't make sense, but they're just putting them there. Historical and fictional are obviously very different, and there's different implications there. But the point that I'm trying to highlight is that you can have a franchise, you can have a movie, you can have a series that has factions or groups or figures who are one gender, or allow both, or have no gender, and it's fine. It's all fine. The thing I personally rally against is just the stupid concept that everything always has to be everything. It does not. And it doesn't mean you're diminishing or shutting other people out or any of these kind of things, but sometimes you want a faction or a narrative to exist as its own thing. You may want to, within its own narrative, be exclusively female. You can have a faction and have it be exclusively male. You can have it be whatever, you know, but what I greatly care about is the establishment of specific narratives and world building and building around factions and all these kind of stuff. Having established characters, especially when they are long and very well established within a franchise. In 40k, you already have a huge mixture of this. You have factions, like I say, that are all female, all male, a mixture, no gender. In the Underhive, you have House Goliath, all male, House Escher, all female. You have bounty hunters of different genders. In the Eldar, you have a society that is mixed and equal when it comes to genders. Likewise, the Tau. In the Necron, you have a race who seem to not have any gender any further. You know, you get the point. What I'm trying to say here, though, although perhaps not very effectively, is that yes, you could write it, you could make it so that Space Marines could include female and male Astartes. You could write that. But why do it? Why upend decades of established lore precedent for the sake of a few op-ed writers and social media junkies who, as soon as they will achieve their goal of just tipping everything upside down for people, move on to their new flavour of the month? You know, doing this kind of thing, upending stuff, pisses people off. And this is why when movies or TV shows decide to upend characters and flip stuff around for no reason other than to just make it a gimmick of doing so, it nearly always goes down like a lead balloon. And while the initial shock value of doing something like that might carry it a little bit, it will almost inevitably kill it in the long run, because it's just not what people wanted. It's not what people want to see, it's not why they like that stuff. And I guess I'll just say that you could have a huge blazing argument about all the stuff to do with the gender politics of it, blah blah blah. You could do that, but in the universe that is 40k, why on earth would you focus on something so absolutely irrelevant? Seriously, in the galaxy of 40k, with the nightmare of chaos, the Tyranids, the horrendous abuses and horrors that occur regardless of who you are or what you look like, you know, hearing this topic come up, it just makes me roll my eyes and go and do something more interesting, because it's just so silly. You know, will Marvel make good 40k comics? Who can honestly even say it all until we know who's writing it, who's illustrating it? The chances of it being brutally dark are probably fairly minimal. The chances of it walking roughly over decades of well-established lore, probably on a coin toss. But seriously, at this point, if that's the way it goes with the comics, it's questionable if that will be the case for the wider narrative. I genuinely think that Games Workshop are well aware of some of the conversations in the community around the concerns, you know, within the established audience. They want to walk 40k forward toward the mainstream whilst not totally destroying their core audience. I think there's a good chance that they'll hold the reins pretty tightly on the comics side of things. At the same time, much more than the comics, I fear very much for 40k moving into the mainstream, for the simple reason that almost everything I've ever enjoyed that has moved to appeal to a bigger audience for the purposes of being a profitable business has usually been then horribly destroyed by it. With that said, I really hope that Games Workshop have some courage and stand strong. Do not allow their franchise be watered down and made into glossy, generic schlock like the hugely profitable but emotionally vapid Star Wars movies. And I think a lot of people can read between the lines that that's a possibility on the horizon. Likewise, the endless conveyor belt of superhero movies that just never seem to end, and are not going to end because they've got bloody movies from the next 20 years lined up. You know, the big positives for 40k is that the writing is already pretty solidly established. You know, you could make a movie from every single Horus Heresy novel as it stands, and that would keep you covered for, again, next 20 years. The one huge strength that 40k has going for it is that however they want to use that back catalogue of novels and establish lore precedent, it means that they also cannot suddenly, well, hopefully not suddenly, crowbar in things that would just retcon and set fire to so much that has already been crafted and forged. You would think that Games Workshop at least would not let them do that, but again, Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars. Anyway, I think I've basically said enough. The simple truth is, nobody knows where this is going or where it will end, but can we just please keep our feet on the ground? All I know is that whenever I see this discussed, the only thing I ever see people saying is please, 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 please don't fuck around with established lore. Please do not crowbar in retcon changes that fundamentally upend such a complex, intricate, long-established franchise. You know, just for once, can we have a series, a franchise that has the courage of its own convictions, that owns what it is? 40k is what it is. Please hear your audience, Games Workshop. Please let us enjoy it. Just enjoy it and let it be.